Okay, so welcome to another deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're really tackling something I think a lot of people have been thinking about, literally thinking about
Yeah.
thinking in English. And,
Right.
one of our listeners sent us a really fantastic resource, this transcript from the LEP Learn English podcast.
Okay.
And I think the title of the episode is How to Think More in English Podcast and Chill for beginners.
Hmm.
And, what we want to do today is kind of go beyond some of the basics that are in there and really pinpoint, like, what are the signs that you're already engaging with English on
Yeah.
this level, even if you don't even realize it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also, like, what are some practical ways to fuel that process?
Exactly. And I think one thing that's important to get out of the way right at the start are some common misconceptions
Yeah.
about what thinking in English is and isn't.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit
Mm?
because the transcript's very clear on what it isn't like. It's not about having this constant, perfect English monologue running through your head.
Not at all. I
Yeah.
mean, no one really thinks like that,
Yeah.
even in their native language. It's
Yeah.
not like you have this perfectly formed, grammatically correct sentences going.
Right.
It's much more fragmented. It's much less structured.
And it definitely doesn't have anything to do with, like, having perfect grammar or a perfect accent in your thoughts, right?
Exactly. It's not about this internal standard of perfection or anything like that.
Right.
It's much more about your brain using English
Mm-hmm.
to process the thoughts that you're having,
Yeah.
whatever those thoughts might be.
And it also doesn't mean that you have to completely erase the way that you think
Mm. Mm.
in your native language.
Yeah, that would be quite difficult.
Yeah.
And maybe even detrimental to the process.
Yeah.
I mean, what's really cool about bilingualism or multilingualism
Mm-hmm.
is that you're able to kind of
Mm-hmm.
draw on these different frameworks
Yeah.
from the different languages that you speak.
Yeah.
And I think trying to suppress one to prioritize the other would probably be quite a difficult task
Yeah.
and maybe even hinder the process.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, too. They mentioned that it's not a sign of failure if you still translate sometimes in your head,
Right.
because even really, really advanced speakers will do that, particularly when they're encountering a new word or a new concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can be a really useful bridge, right? If
Mhm.
you're grappling with a difficult concept
Yeah.
to use translation in your head.
Yeah.
So it's a natural part of the process.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a stage that you have to move beyond completely.
Totally. Okay. So now that we've cleared up what it isn't,
Mm-hmm.
what is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Learn English podcast talks about direct processing.
Right.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, I think what's interesting about direct processing
Mm-hmm.
is it really is about the immediacy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like when you hear the word dog,
Mm.
you think of the word for dog in your native language,
Right.
and then you think of the animal.
Right.
The idea is, with direct processing, you hear the word dog in English,
Mm-hmm.
and immediately in your mind, the concept, the image,
Mm-hmm.
all of that pops up. So it's a much more streamlined process.
Yeah, you're cutting out that middleman.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
the internal translator.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this can actually make processing English
Mm-hmm.
when you're in conversations so much easier and faster.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. They also talk about understanding non-visual concepts
Mm-hmm.
directly in English. So
Yeah.
what does that look like?
Well, I think this is where it gets really interesting
Mm-hmm.
because it moves beyond just concrete things that you can visualize.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, let's say you're listening to a joke in English or someone's telling you about an idiom in English.
Mm-hmm.
When you're starting to think in English,
Mm-hmm.
these things start to make sense to you intuitively. You don't have
Yeah.
to break them down into their component parts.
Uh.
You don't have to translate everything back to your native language
Yeah.
to really grasp what the meaning is. You kind of just get it.
Yeah. And that's a really good sign.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then they also mention automatic responses.
Mhm.
So these are like phrases that just kind of roll off the tongue
Right.
in English without you even having to consciously construct them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So think about things like greetings,
Hmm.
like how are you doing?
Yeah.
Or you even just saying your name.
Right.
These are things that we've learned and produced as chunks.
Yeah.
So your brain recognizes the social cue
Mm-hmm.
and it automatically just switches into English
Yeah.
and produces the correct phrase without you having to think about it word for word.
Yeah, that's a really good sign
Yeah, absolutely.
that you're using English or thinking in English in at least certain contexts.
Mm.
Then they get into these micro moments, which I thought were super fascinating. And these are like these tiny little instances in your daily life where you're actually thinking in English,
Mm-hmm.
but you might not even realize it. So what are some of these?
Well, I think an example that we can all probably relate to,
Mm-hmm.
given how much time we spend online,
Yeah.
is reading captions on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're scrolling through Instagram, you're on TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
and you come across a caption in English.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever just understood the gist of it
Mm-hmm.
without really having to translate anything in your mind?
Oh, yeah, totally. Especially the short ones.
Mm-hmm.
Or like the ones that are really tied to the visual.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, I don't know, my brain just seems to process.
Like, that's exactly what's happening. Your brain's skipping over that translation step,
Mm-hmm.
and it's going straight to the meaning
Yeah.
in English.
Yeah. It feels really natural, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They also mention using common English interjections.
Mm-hmm.
So things like, oh my God,
Right.
or thank you. Even if English isn't your first language,
Mm-hmm.
if you find yourself using those kinds of expressions without even thinking about it,
Right.
that's another sign.
Yeah, it's almost like they've become part of your,
Yeah.
emotional vocabulary.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Totally. Yeah.
And then there's this example about mixing English words
Mm.
into your native language when you're doing something like making a grocery list or a to-do list.
Yeah, that's a really subtle one, but I think it's super significant.
Mm-hmm.
If you're writing yourself a note in your native language,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden you just include this English word,
Yeah.
that's a sign that that word is very accessible for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it might even be easier or feel more natural
Yeah.
than using the equivalent in your native language.
Yeah.
And so I think that really shows how English is kind of starting to sneak into your daily life.
Yeah. So if these little moments are happening, why don't we realize
Right?
that we're thinking in English?
I think that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And I think the transcript gives some really interesting reasons for this.
Okay.
So first of all, our brains are really good at kind of
Mm-hmm.
operating in the background,
Yeah.
much like, an app on your phone that's running silently.
Yeah.
You're not always aware of all the complex processes that are happening.
Right.
So, you're not really thinking about your brain thinking in English.
It's like breathing.
Yeah.
You don't notice it unless you think about it.
Right.
And then the transcript also mentions Stephen Krashen and his theory about language acquisition
Right.
happening subconsciously to some degree. So,
Yeah, through comprehensible input.
right.
So you're exposed to language that you can understand.
Yeah.
And your brain just kind of absorbs it
Yeah.
without you really having to make a conscious effort.
Yeah. And then there was also the mention of automaticity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they referenced Logan's research on that.
Right.
Which essentially suggests that the more we do something,
Mm.
it becomes more automatic.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we're talking about thinking in English,
Right.
the more we do it,
Mm-hmm.
the less effort it takes.
Right. And that's when you can really start to focus on what you want to say
Right.
as opposed to how to say it.
Yeah.
So the language becomes less of a barrier,
Yeah.
and it just becomes a tool for communication.
So because we're focused on what we want to communicate,
Mm.
we don't notice that our brains are kind of
Sure.
shifting into English mode.
Exactly.
And it's interesting how all of this circles back to those automatic phrases that we talked about earlier.
Mhm.
Because we've encountered them and used them so many times,
Mhm.
they just come out naturally.
Right. It requires very little effort
Yeah.
to produce them.
Okay, so how can we notice these moments more, and how can we actually encourage them to happen more?
Yeah.
So the
Exactly.
transcript had some suggestions I thought were really helpful. The first one was to catch yourself in the act.
Yeah. So this is really about being mindful
Mm-hmm.
and paying attention to your thoughts
Mm-hmm.
throughout the day.
Yeah.
So, see if you can notice those moments
Yeah.
where you read a sign in English and you understood it right away.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you're singing along to an English song in your head.
Mm.
Or you just catch yourself muttering an English phrase.
Yeah.
That's your brain engaging with the language.
Yeah.
So really pay attention to those moments.
It's like becoming a detective
Yeah,
in your own mind.
exactly.
But, some people might find that a little bit difficult.
Hmm.
Like if they're not used to being introspective.
Right.
What are some other things people could try?
Well, one thing they mentioned in the transcript
Mm-hmm.
that I thought was a really good suggestion
Yeah.
was to try keeping a journal in English.
Mm-hmm.
But the key here
Yeah.
is that it doesn't have to be anything super formal or complex.
Yeah.
Just jotting down a few sentences at the end of the day
Yeah.
about what you did,
Yeah.
how you're feeling,
Yeah.
can be a really powerful way to practice thinking and writing
Yeah.
in English.
I love that it takes the pressure off.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not about perfect grammar.
Mm-hmm.
It's just about engaging with the
Yeah,
language.
exactly.
I thought this next suggestion was a little bit weird, but then it kind of made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was to kind of talk to yourself
Mm-hmm.
in English throughout the day, like
Mm.
describing what you're doing as you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think the transcript mentioned something about, like,
Yeah.
imagine you're on a reality TV show
Yeah.
or you're in the office.
Yeah, exactly.
So just like narrating your actions
Yeah.
as you go about your day.
It's like giving yourself that internal commentary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it can be a really fun way
Yeah.
to practice thinking in English.
Yeah. And they make a really good point here that you should just focus on the words that you already know. Like, don't worry about trying to sound super fancy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just use the language that you're comfortable with.
Right. Because at this stage, it's really about communication,
Yeah,
not about impressing anyone.
totally. So they actually included a section in the transcript specifically for how to know if someone is already thinking in English.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of hit on some of these same things.
Yeah.
But they were saying that, like, one of the biggest signs is if you can understand phrases in English
Mm-hmm.
without translating them.
Right.
And also if you just kind of like naturally mix English words into your thoughts.
Right.
Or your speech in your native language.
Yeah, that shows that you're not really separating the two.
Yeah,
You're kind of
yeah.
integrating them together.
Totally. And they even included a bunch of common English phrases
Mm-hmm.
and their meanings, which I thought was really helpful because I think when you can understand those kinds of phrases,
Without having to, like, break them down.
right.
You know, it really shows that you're kind of shifting into that English mode.
Absolutely.
So, for example, they mentioned light bulb moment. So that just means like a sudden realization.
Right. Or an idea.
Yeah, or an idea. Yeah, and then they also mentioned roll off the tongue, which means, like, it's easy to say.
Yeah, something that's natural.
Yeah, it just comes out naturally.
Yeah.
Catch on. So that just means, like, to understand something
Right.
under the radar. So to go unnoticed or stay low key
Right.
and then sleep on something, which means to think about something overnight
Right.
and then decide in the morning. Yeah.
And what's really interesting about these kinds of phrases
Yeah.
is that they don't always have a neat equivalent in
Right.
other languages.
Yeah.
And so being able to understand them really shows that you're kind of thinking.
In English.
So to put it all together,
Mm-hmm.
you know, thinking in English isn't like this
Mm-hmm.
big dramatic event.
Right.
It's really just this collection of small moments that happen throughout the day.
Yeah.
And chances are, if you're listening to this, you're probably already doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
More than you realize.
It's really about recognizing and appreciating those small moments where you're using English without even thinking about it,
Yeah.
and celebrating those as signs of progress
Yeah.
in your language learning journey.
And, you know, to kind of help yourself
Mm-hmm.
along that journey, you can try out some of these tips,
Right.
like journaling in English, talking to yourself in English, just becoming more aware of those moments where your brain is already using English.
And the more you do these things,
Yeah.
the more natural and automatic it will become.
Yeah. So for our listeners, as you continue on your English language journey,
Mm-hmm.
I want to leave you with this final thought.
Mm-hmm.
You know the Learn English podcast episode that we're drawing from today?
Mm-hmm.
They encourage you to try to remember, like, the very first time you remember understanding or using English without having to translate.
Right.
I want you to think about that. Like, what was that moment? What were you doing? And what do you think contributed to that? Because reflecting on that might actually reveal some really interesting things
Yeah. And
about your own language learning journey.
it might give you some clues about what works for you
Yeah.
and what you can do to continue improving.
Yeah. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.